Jackson Hayes rode alone through the red dust of the New Mexico territory, Winchester rifle balanced across his saddle horn, the late afternoon sun casting his shadow long across ground that had seen more blood than rain. His weathered face, lined with 42 hard years of frontier life, remained fixed forward as he tracked the hoof prints that had become his obsession these past 3 weeks. Bishop's gang, the same outlaws who had ambushed the supply wagon, killed his former ranger partner, and left 5 families destitute when they raided the settlement at Eagle Pass. The same men who'd struck a devil's bargain with a corrupt federal official to steal Apache and Mexican land along the border. The same men Jackson had sworn to bring to justice or to their graves. He checked his Colt Peacemaker, the blued steel finish worn at the edges from years of service. 6 bullets in the chamber, 12 more in his belt, and 4 shells for the Winchester. Not enough if he faced the whole gang, but enough for the advanced scouts he'd been tracking since dawn. The wind shifted, bringing the sharp tang of wood smoke. Jackson pulled his horse up short, his hand automatically moving to the rifle. He slid from the saddle, boots landing silently on the hard-packed earth. 20 years as a Texas Ranger had taught him to move like a ghost, to see what others missed, to hear what the land whispered. The tracks led down into a dry creek bed, the banks rising steep on either side. Perfect spot for an ambush, but the tracks told him only 3 riders had passed this way. His eyes narrowed, scanning the ridgeline, looking for the telltale glint of metal or movement. That's when he heard it, a woman's scream, cut short. Jackson didn't hesitate. There was no calculation, no weighing of odds. 6 years ago, he'd buried his wife Maria and their son after fever swept through their homestead. 6 years of living with the knowledge that sometimes standing aside was the same as pulling the trigger yourself. He secured his horse behind a stand of scrub cedar and moved down the bank. Winchester held ready. As he rounded the bend in the creek bed, he saw them, 3 men surrounding a young Apache woman. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her lip bloodied. One man held a rope, another a knife pressed against her throat. The third leaned on his rifle, laughing. Jackson recognized the face of the man with the knife, Frank Coulter, one of Bishop's lieutenants. The man who'd put a bullet in Deputy Marshal Williams, Jackson's former partner. No warnings, no demands to surrender. Jackson's first shot caught the man with the rope square in the forehead, dropping him before the echo bounced off the canyon walls. The second man, Coulter, spun toward the sound, his knife slashing wildly. Jackson was already moving, swinging the Winchester like a club, the solid wooden stock connecting with Coulter's jaw with a sickening crack. The third man fired, the bullet tearing through Jackson's coat sleeve. Jackson pivoted, driving the rifle butt into the man's temple, sending him staggering. But the outlaw recovered faster than expected, lunging forward with a hunting knife. White-hot pain exploded across Jackson's ribs as the blade sliced deep. He grunted, twisted, and struck again, catching the man across the bridge of the nose. As the outlaw fell to his knees, Coulter came at Jackson from behind, blade flashing. A second slash opened across Jackson's back, then a third at his side. The world tilted as he fought to stay upright, blood soaking his shirt. He drove his elbow back hard, felt it connect with Coulter's sternum. The man doubled over, but not before his knife found Jackson's flesh once more, sinking deep beneath his ribs. Jackson turned, drew his Colt in one fluid motion, and fired twice. Coulter's chest erupted in red as he staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock before he crumpled to the ground. The third outlaw scrambled to his feet, terror replacing bravado. He slashed wildly one last time, opening a 5th wound across Jackson's chest before fleeing down the creek bed, his boots kicking up dust as he ran. Jackson dropped to one knee, the peacemaker suddenly heavy in his hand. Blood soaked his shirt, ran down his back, pooled at his feet. Through gritted teeth, he sucked in shallow breaths, each one a battle against the fire spreading through his chest. 5 cuts, he thought grimly. That's pushing any man's luck. A shadow fell across him. The Apache woman stood there, her dark eyes assessing him with a mixture of wariness and something else. Determination, perhaps. Up close, he could see the dirt on her cheek, the bruise beneath her eye, the torn neckline of her dress exposing the curve of her shoulder. She made no move to adjust it. Instead, she knelt beside him and pressed her palm firmly against the worst wound in his side. The pain nearly blinded him, but he bit back a curse. When he tried to stand, his legs betrayed him, the world tilting sideways. "I'll get back to my horse," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Just need to—" She was already pulling his arm over her shoulder, smaller than him but surprisingly strong. They took 3 steps before his vision darkened at the edges, the creek bed seeming to rise and fall beneath him like the deck of a storm-tossed ship. His last thought before consciousness fled was a simple recognition of irony, that after hunting killers across 3 territories, he would die being helped by an Apache woman whose name he didn't even know. When Jackson awoke, the world was firelight and shadow. Pain throbbed with each heartbeat, but it was the voices that pulled him fully into consciousness. Women's voices speaking Apache. He kept his eyes closed, listening, assessing. 3 distinct voices, the woman he'd saved and 2 others. He finally opened his eyes, squinting against the firelight. The shelter was crude, an abandoned trading post with one wall partially collapsed, the roof held up by ancient pine beams. The woman he'd rescued sat nearby, watching him with unblinking dark eyes. Behind her stood 2 others, an older woman with a face hardened by years of hardship, and a younger one, barely more than a girl, who clutched a blanket around her shoulders. "You pull knife out," Jackson said, his voice rough as gravel. The woman nodded once, her expression unchanged. When Jackson tried to sit up, pain knifed through his side. The oldest of the 3 women stepped forward but didn't touch him. "You alone when I found you?" Jackson asked, addressing the woman he'd saved. She hesitated, measuring him with her eyes before answering softly, "Not anymore." Jackson took in the sight of the 3 of them, gaunt, wary survivors. He'd seen it before in settlements raided by Comancheros, in towns ravaged by fever, people clinging to each other when everything else had been stripped away. "What's your name?" he asked the woman who dragged him to safety. "Maya," she replied, then nodding toward the others, "Helena, Raven." "Jackson Hayes," he offered, then winced as he shifted position. "Former Texas Ranger." Helena's eyes narrowed at that. Rangers had a reputation among the tribes, and it wasn't for mercy. "That man who ran," Jackson continued, "he'll bring others. Bishop's gang, 8, maybe 10 men. Killers, all of them." "Then we die here," Helena said flatly. "No." Jackson's voice was quiet but firm. "I've got a place. Cabin in the valley beyond Broken Ridge. Half-day's ride. Stocked for winter. Roof that doesn't leak." He looked each woman in the eye. "You help me get there. You stay as long as you want. Nobody touches you under my roof." Raven spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you help us?" Jackson's gaze turned to the fire. "Because I've stood by before when I shouldn't have. Won't do it again." He looked back at them, his expression hardened by resolve. "But I can't ride alone. Not with these wounds. You leave me here. I don't last till morning." The 3 women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Maya nodded. "We go at first light," she said. Dawn brought a cold wind and the first flakes of snow. They broke camp in silence, each movement deliberate, efficient. Jackson gritted his teeth as he stood, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. Maya wrapped fresh bandages around his torso, her touch clinical but not rough. Helena had already departed to retrieve Jackson's horse and mule from where he'd left them the previous day. She returned with both animals and a grim expression. "Tracks," she said simply. "3 riders, not from yesterday, older but close." Jackson nodded once. "Comancheros, most likely. They work with Bishop sometimes." He checked his Winchester, the familiar weight of it steadying him. "We need to move. Now." They traveled in silence, Jackson leading them away from the main trails, taking game paths that only experienced trackers would notice. Each step sent fire through his wounds, but he kept his face impassive. The Apache women moved with the same quiet efficiency, Maya staying close to Jackson, watching for signs he might fall. By midday, the snow was falling steadily. They stopped at a narrow stream to refill canteens. While Raven kept watch, Jackson leaned against a boulder, breathing through the pain that had become a constant companion. "Why do they hunt you?" Maya asked quietly, checking his bandages again. Jackson's eyes met hers. "Because I know what they did. Bishop's gang hit the settlement at Eagle Pass 3 weeks ago. Killed my former partner, Deputy Marshal Williams. Took everything of value." He paused. "But it wasn't just robbery. They're working with a federal land agent named Garrett. They drive people off their land, settlers, Mexicans, Apache. Then Garrett declares it abandoned and sells it to the railroad for 10 times its value." Helena, who had been listening nearby, spoke. "Our people were attacked 2 moons ago. Soldiers came first, then men like those at the creek. They took everything, killed many. We were separated from our band," Maya added. "Found each other on the trail." "No one to take you in?" Jackson asked. Raven laughed bitterly. "Other bands will not take women without men to speak for them. Settlers will kill us or worse." Jackson nodded, understanding all too well the brutal calculus of survival in this territory. They continued their journey, the landscape gradually changing from scrub and rock to pine forest as they climbed toward Broken Ridge. Jackson's vision sometimes blurred at the edges, but he pushed on, 1 foot in front of the other. By mid-afternoon, they reached the ridge that overlooked the narrow valley where his cabin stood. "We go down through those trees," he said, pointing to a stand of pines. "Cabin's built against that rock face. Can't see it from the main trail." As they began their descent, Raven suddenly grabbed Maya's arm, pointing. In the distance, barely visible through the falling snow, riders approached from the east. "Bishop," Jackson said grimly. "They found our trail." Helena assessed the distance. "They will reach the valley before us." Jackson's mind raced, weighing options that were all bad. Then he spotted a narrow ravine cutting through the ridge. "There's another way, old game trail, steeper, but it'll put us at the cabin before them." The descent was treacherous, the trail barely wide enough for the horses. Twice Jackson nearly fell, saved only by Maya's quick reflexes. By the time they reached the valley floor, the snow was falling heavily, obscuring their tracks. The cabin appeared before them, a sturdy structure of hewn logs built against a rock outcropping. Jackson's legs finally betrayed him as they reached the door, and Maya had to support his weight as Helena pushed the door open. Inside was cold but dry. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a narrow bunk against another. Shelves held supplies, beans, coffee, salt pork, ammunition. It wasn't much, but it was defensible. "Get a fire started," Jackson said, lowering himself into the room's only chair. "Then bar that door." While Helena and Raven worked, Maya examined Jackson's wounds. The bleeding had slowed, but infection was setting in. His skin hot to the touch, his breathing labored. "You have medicine?" she asked. "Cabinet above the fireplace," he replied. "Whiskey and willow bark." As Maya retrieved them, Jackson's gaze fell on the small wooden box on the shelf beside his bunk. Inside were the few treasures he'd kept after Maria's death: her wedding ring, a lock of their son's hair, the badge he'd worn as a ranger. The fire caught, spreading warmth through the cabin. Outside, the snow continued to fall, a white curtain obscuring the world beyond. For a moment, a strange peace settled over them. 4 survivors in a shelter against the storm. Then came the sound they'd been dreading. Hoofbeats approaching, muffled by snow but unmistakable. "They're here," Raven whispered from her position by the window. Jackson pulled himself to his feet, pain forgotten in the rush of survival. He moved to the gun cabinet and retrieved his shotgun, a greener with a shortened barrel, deadly at close range. "Helena, take the Winchester. Position by the north window. Maya, there's a trap door beneath the rug, ammunition stored there, and a Remington revolver." His voice was steady, the voice of a man who had faced death many times before. "Raven, get down in the root cellar. There's a tunnel that leads out behind the rocks if things go bad." But Raven shook her head. "I can shoot," she said simply. Jackson didn't argue. He'd seen too much to doubt that even the young learned to fight in this land. He handed her a pistol from his belt. "8 shots," he said. "Make them count." They took their positions just as the first riders appeared through the snow. 8 men, heavily armed, led by a tall figure Jackson recognized immediately, Samuel Bishop himself. Bishop dismounted, his long coat flapping in the wind as he approached the cabin. "Hayes," he called out. "I know you're in there. Come on out and maybe I won't burn this place to the ground." Jackson stood to the side of the window, out of sight. "What do you want, Bishop?" "You know damn well what I want. You killed 2 of my men, and I see you've taken something else that doesn't belong to you. 3 Apache women worth a pretty penny to certain buyers across the border." Jackson's jaw tightened. He glanced at Maya, who stood ready with the Remington, her expression hard as stone. "They're not for sale," Jackson called back. "Neither am I. Ride away while you can, Bishop." Bishop's laugh carried through the howling wind. "Always the righteous one, aren't you, Hayes? Just like in the Rangers. Well, let me tell you something. Your partner, Williams, he begged before I killed him. Told me all about your little investigation, about how you were going to bring down me and Garrett." Jackson's blood ran cold. "Williams was worth 10 of you." "Maybe so," Bishop replied, "but he's dead, and so are you." The first shot shattered the window beside Helena. She ducked, then rose and fired the Winchester with calm precision. One of Bishop's men tumbled from his horse, clutching his chest. The air erupted with gunfire. Bullets splintered wood, thudded into logs. Jackson fired the greener twice, the roar deafening in the confined space. 2 more of Bishop's men went down, but the others were taking cover, settling in for a siege. Maya fired the Remington through a narrow gap in the shutters, her aim steady. Raven positioned herself by the back window, watching for anyone trying to circle around. For 10 minutes, the exchange of gunfire continued. Jackson knew they were outgunned, but the cabin's thick walls provided good protection. If they could hold out until nightfall, maybe the storm would force Bishop to retreat. Then he heard it, the sound of breaking glass from the back of the cabin. Someone had found the small window to the storage room. "Raven!" Jackson shouted, but it was too late. A shot rang out, and Raven cried out, clutching her shoulder as she fell. Maya rushed to her side while Helena covered the front. Jackson, despite his wounds, moved toward the back room, shotgun ready. The outlaw who had broken in never had a chance to fire again. Jackson's shotgun blast caught him full in the chest, throwing him back against the wall. But the diversion had served its purpose. The front door splintered under the impact of a battering ram, a log wielded by 3 of Bishop's men. Helena fired, dropped one, but the others were through, pistols blazing. Jackson staggered back into the main room, pain forgotten in the rush of combat. He fired the shotgun's remaining barrel, then drew his peacemaker. Helena had taken cover behind an overturned table. Maya dragged Raven behind the stone hearth, firing the Remington with one hand. Through the broken door stepped Bishop himself, a Winchester in his hands and a smile on his face. "End of the trail, Hayes," he said. "Not yet," Jackson replied, raising his pistol. Two shots rang out simultaneously. Jackson felt the impact of Bishop's bullet in his chest, a burning sensation that stole his breath. But his own shot had found its mark. Bishop's right shoulder, spinning him around. Bishop recovered quickly, raising his rifle again. But before he could fire, Maya stepped out from behind the hearth and put a bullet squarely between his eyes. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader fall, lost heart. One turned to flee and was cut down by Helena's Winchester. The other threw down his weapon, hands raised in surrender. Jackson slumped against the wall, fresh blood soaking his shirt. The cabin swam before his eyes, voices becoming distant. He felt hands lowering him to the floor, saw Maya's face above him, her lips moving, though he couldn't hear the words. Darkness closed in from the edges of his vision. His last thought before consciousness fled was that at least he'd kept his word. They were safe under his roof. Days passed in a fever dream. Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness, aware sometimes of hands changing bandages, of liquid being spooned between his lips, of soft voices speaking in Apache. Other times he relived moments from his past, riding with the Rangers, meeting Maria at her father's ranch, holding his son for the first time, burying them both beneath a cottonwood tree. When he finally woke fully, weak sunlight filtered through the repaired window. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling in the hearth. He turned his head slowly, taking in the sight before him. Helena sat at the table, cleaning the Winchester with practiced hands. Raven, her shoulder bandaged, sorted through a pile of supplies, ammunition, canned goods, medical supplies taken from Bishop's men. And Maya stood by the stove, stirring something that filled the cabin with the aroma of meat and herbs. She was the first to notice he was awake. Their eyes met across the room, and for the first time, he saw her smile, small, reserved, but genuine. "You return," she said simply. "Seems so," Jackson replied, his voice rough from disuse. "How long?" "4 days," Helena answered without looking up from the rifle. "Snow stopped yesterday. We buried the bodies." Jackson attempted to sit up, grimacing at the pain that flared across his chest. Maya was beside him instantly, supporting his shoulders as he maneuvered into a sitting position. "Bishop?" he asked. "Dead," Maya confirmed. "The others too, except one who ran. The coward who cut you at the creek. He escaped." Jackson nodded slowly, processing this information. "He'll be back, not alone." "Then we will be ready," Helena said, the Winchester gleaming in her hands. Raven approached, offering Jackson a cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute he'd been drinking for months. "From their supplies," she explained, seeing his surprise. He took a sip, the rich bitterness, a luxury he'd almost forgotten. Looking at the three women, he realized something had changed while he hovered between life and death. They moved through his cabin with the ease of people at home, not guests or temporary allies. "You saved my life," he said finally. Maya shrugged. "You saved ours first." A simple equation, but one that rarely balanced so neatly in this harsh land. As days turned to weeks, Jackson's strength gradually returned. The 5 stab wounds healed slowly, leaving scars that pulled tight when he moved too quickly. The bullet wound in his chest took longer, but Maya's knowledge of healing herbs, combined with Jackson's own stubborn refusal to die, eventually won out. Winter settled over the valley, deep snow isolating the cabin from the outside world. It should have felt claustrophobic, 4 people who barely knew each other confined in a small space. Instead, a rhythm developed, Helena and Jackson taking turns at watch. Maya tending the garden she'd started in the protected southern corner of the cabin. Raven proving herself adept at setting traps for rabbits and squirrels. They shared stories in the evenings. Jackson spoke of his years as a ranger, of the good men he'd served with, and the corruption that had driven him to resign. He told them about Maria, the daughter of a Mexican rancher who defied her family to marry him, and of their son who had his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness. The women shared their own histories. Helena had been married to a warrior killed in a battle with soldiers 2 years before. Raven was the daughter of a minor chief separated from her family during a forced relocation. Maya revealed little of her past, but Jackson gathered she had been educated at a mission school before returning to her people, explaining her command of English. One evening, as snow piled against the windows and the wind howled through the pines, Maya asked the question that had lingered since their first meeting. "Why did you fight for us? At the creek. You could have walked away." Jackson stared into the fire, memories flickering like the flames. 6 years ago, raiders hit a settlement near Fort Davis. I was passing through, heard the shooting. I kept riding. He paused. Found out later 8 people died. Women, children. Another pause. Made myself a promise that day. No more riding past. Maya nodded, understanding the weight of such a promise. The winter deepened, then gradually began to loosen its grip. As the snow melted and the first green appeared on the trees, they knew the isolation that had protected them would soon end. One morning, Jackson saddled his horse for the first time since his injuries. "Need to ride to Eagle Pass," he announced. "Collect the bounty on Bishop. Clear my name." Helena looked up from where she was splitting wood. "You think they will believe you? Got his body, got his gang's weapons, and Marshal Johnson in Eagle Pass knows me from the Rangers. He'll listen." Jackson checked his saddle cinch. "I'll be back in 3 days. 4 at most." Maya stepped forward, a small leather pouch in her hand. "Medicine," she said, "for the trail." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, not spoken, but understood. Jackson nodded his thanks. 3 days later, he returned as promised, his saddlebags heavy with supplies purchased with the bounty money. More importantly, he carried papers, official documentation from Marshal Johnson, clearing his name and confirming Bishop's crimes. As spring bloomed across the valley, they expanded the cabin, adding a second room and enlarging the garden. Twice riders approached, once a U.S. Army patrol, once a group of settlers looking for land. Each time Jackson met them outside the cabin, his peacemaker visible at his hip. Each time, they rode away without incident. The lone survivor from Bishop's gang never returned. Whether he died from his wounds or simply fled the territory, they never knew. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson, Jackson noticed something new carved into the doorframe of the cabin. 3 Apache symbols alongside the initials J.H. "What do they mean?" he asked Maya, who sat beside him on the rough-hewn bench. "Our names," she replied, "in the old way." Jackson ran his fingers over the carved symbols, feeling their permanence in the wood. "So folks know who lives here?" Maya nodded. "So they know this is home." Home, a word Jackson hadn't used since burying Maria and their son, a concept he'd abandoned along with his ranger badge and his faith in justice. He looked at the 3 women who had saved his life as surely as he had saved theirs. Helena, strong and vigilant, teaching Raven to shoot with the precision of a born warrior. Raven, no longer the frightened girl from the creek bed, setting traps and learning to track game. And Maya, whose quiet strength had held them all together through the darkest days of winter. They were not the family he had lost, but they were the family he had found, forged in blood, in survival, and a promise kept. As the last light faded from the sky, Jackson Hayes made a new promise, that whatever came, whatever dangers still waited beyond the valley, he would defend this home and these people with the same fierce determination that had driven him to take 5 stab wounds for a woman whose name he hadn't even known. Some oaths were written in blood. This one was carved in wood, etched in scars and sealed by the simple act of remaining when all sense said to run. It would endure as long as the cabin stood against the wind and the rain and the passing of seasons, a testament to the family created not by birth, but by choice.